Countries in the global south are facing a horrific debt crisis. But will thoughts and prayers from Western countries and UN agencies be enough to address this issue? It's a case of one occupying power sanctifying the other as Israel recognizes Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara. What does this mean for the Sahrawi people's struggle for self-determination? And finally, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry did go to China and there was a lot of talk of cooperation. But will this contribute to a reduction of tensions in the region? We'll be addressing all these questions and more in this episode of Daily Debrief. The UN Secretary General has expressed deep concern over the growing indebtedness of developing countries and has asked for immediate steps to form an effective debt relief system. At the same time, the UN Development Fund's administrator has expressed concern over the lack of breakthroughs on this issue at the G20 finance meeting that concluded in India. But these expressions of concern seem too little, too less at a time when the situation is getting worse for many countries. Now, on Daily Debrief, we have often talked about how debt affects countries in the global south. And to take a look at the larger picture, we have with us Abdul. Abdul, thank you so much for joining us. So, the UN Secretary General, of course, talking about an issue which many activists, many leaders of the global south have been highlighting for a very long time, which is the impact of debt, how countries are really struggling under this, especially in the global south countries in Africa and Asia. But maybe could you first take us through what his comments were and maybe explain the scope of the problem?
Well, if you see the reports, there are different reports in last few weeks basically highlighting how a large number of developing countries across the world, and of course mostly in Africa and Asia and Latin America, are struggling to basically fight with or deal with their basic social issues like poverty, illiteracy, education, health. All these issues they are not able to. Of course, there are there are many reasons which basically are preventing their dealing with these kind of social issues. But one major reason which has been highlighted again and again is the lack of finances. And if you see, the reports say that a large number of these countries are using the crucial finances which should go to addressing these basic issues like poverty, health, education, are going to basically service their debts which they have borrowed in the process of running their governments, running their social security, social development programs, and so on and so forth. So there is a vicious cycle which has been created because of this particular system of international finance, which again the reports highlight is predominantly private, and which basically provides discriminatory rate aid and other kind of loan to different kinds of countries on discriminatory rates. For example, one of the reports highlights that how the the borrowing which an African country does is almost 8 times higher than a rich European country. So you can see a large number of these countries, and the reports highlight around 46 to 52 and even more number of countries are spending anywhere between 7 to 10% of their earnings, their revenue, on servicing the debt which they have borrowed in the past. And that basically, of course, scuttles their capacity, their potential to address their basic concerns of the citizens, which ultimately results into rising rate of poverty, rising rate of course, health related issues, and prevalent illiteracy and lack of adequate education in the large number of people across the majority of the world. Around 3.3 billion people, one of the reports highlight, are in those countries which basically are affected by this particular debt crisis. Along with the fact that there are 52 countries, they say, are in a very serious condition. And if there is no debt relief system created at this moment, most of these countries are going to collapse in the near future.
Yeah. Right, Abdul. Of course, debt is a multidimensional crisis, and often I think we've had many interviews in the past also which talk about this, where people have pointed out, academics have pointed out, for instance, that a lot of debt is now held by private players like BlackRock, for instance. It's no longer the age of countries or even bodies like the IMF giving debt anymore. So it's actually, the problem is expanded in various ways. But I think one important thing to note is that while there's been all this talk about dealing with debt, Has there been any sustainable solution put forward to address the issue of companies like BlackRock or even the IMF and the World Bank, the kind of terms they've imposed to sort of push back against these terms? Is there any sustainable solution that is being put forward?
No, if you see the what Guterres was saying, that though we recognize the problem, there is a problem. When it comes to solution, there is nothing substantial on the ground. The activists, particularly from the left and the international groups, recently have picked up, particularly the UN has picked up this particular idea of debt relief. But if you see, when it comes to finding a mechanism to address how it will be done, it is basically left as if now to individual countries. And again, these are not private players, of course, which, as you rightly pointed out, are not anymore the substantial donors. The substantial debt providers. It is primarily the private sector. So how to coordinate between the private and the public sectors, which are given the fact that the private sector is the largest donor now, largest provider of debt now. So that mechanism is still not there. For example, one of the reports talks about how we need to kind of restructure the debt which are provided to the particularly the developing countries in the world, how the loans which are provided should have a minimum interest rate, and a kind of longer period of repayment should be provided. These are the solutions proposed on the table, but it does not talk about how the private players, which are the dominant player, will be brought on board to address this issue. Ultimately, it basically comes down to the individual countries like the China, U.S. appealing to these countries to kind of do something. Even if they start doing something, though there is a reluctance, of course, particularly in the developed capitalist world, there is a very strong reluctance to kind of restructure the debts which they have provided to developing countries. But even if suppose they agree to do it tomorrow, that will not address the larger issue. And there is a need to bring in the private players into that larger mechanism. And that, of course, can only be initiated by the countries which are basically the host of these private players, like the Western Europe or the North America.
Right, of course, also we've also seen the potential of, say, something like the BRICS Bank coming into play, and we don't know, of course, how it will work, what it will bring to this situation, but we'll be tracking it. Thank you so much, but stay back because we want to quiz you regarding the next development as well, which is from West Asia and North Africa. And in a very unsurprising move, Israel has officially recognized the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara. It is also expected to open a consulate in the occupied city of Dakhla. Now, this is the latest in the process of normalization of ties between Israel and Morocco, which was sealed in the very controversial Abraham Accords during the Trump administration. Now, Morocco claimed sovereignty over Western Sahara after the former colonial power, that is Spain, withdrew from its territory in 1975. In 1991, we need to remember that the UN Security Council actually established a mission to conduct a referendum. Now, this referendum was regarding the Sahrawi people's right to self-determination. But this referendum has not been held, surprise, and it has been sabotaged by Morocco all these years. So, Abdul, coming back to this question, no surprises, I would say, considering that this has been sort of building up.
Exactly. If you see, ever since the Abraham Accord, even before that, there were talks about Israel recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, as US did in 2020, when the Trump basically put it as a condition that if you normalize the relationship with Israel, we will recognize your sovereignty over the Western Sahara. So that is basically was building up for a very long time. At least for last 3-4 years, and this basically also falls into the you can say the larger geopolitical game in which particularly the US is pushing a large number of countries in Arab world and in other parts of the world to normalize relations with Israel at the cost of course, certain fundamental issues, and those issues are often taken as only geopolitical issues by countries like Israel or United States, but forgetting that there is a struggle going on the ground for the right to self-determination of the people in Western Sahara, and it is completely ignored. Just like the struggle of Palestinians are ignored on one front, the struggle of the Western Saharan people are also ignored.
And Abdul, of course, in this context, this leads to the question of the dynamics in the region itself. We know that the United States has been backing Israel, of course, despite the fact that Israel has been conducting a very extensive and cruel occupation, even by their standards, of what has been happening in Palestine right now. And Israel has been very desperately trying to, I think, gain more acceptance from various countries in the region. There have been talks even of Saudi Arabia somehow coming into the picture, although it has its own conditions. But specifically from the context of Morocco, what is really Morocco? What is Morocco's angle in this? Because the Israeli angle is very clear.
See, Morocco, of course, Morocco is looking for extending its legitimacy over Western Sahara. So it is an occupying power. It basically has occupied a territory which was basically a territory of the local people who claimed independent state, who claimed right to self-determination. But given the fact that the Western Sahara is a mineral-rich area, it also has a larger coastal coast, which basically used for shipping. So and fishing in particular. So given this economic potential, Morocco as an occupying power does not want it to go. And in order to do that, of course, it is basically attempting to bargain with as many countries who are interested, of course, which have their own problems like Israel, looking for larger international legitimacy, but also European Union and countries like other countries in the region, which basically are looking for economic benefits out of the resources which the Western Sahara holds. So it's a colonial project, which basically is what Morocco is looking for. And given the fact that despite all these years, it has been more than 1970s, it has more than 40, 50 years, still majority of the world's nations do not recognize Morocco's authority over Western Sahara. And Polisario Front, which basically runs as a self-government there in that locality, a part of that region, has as many countries recognizing its presence, legitimate right over the territory. Given this particular, you can say the failure of Morocco in the last few decades to gain legitimacy for its occupation, it seems that it is desperate to compromise on the fundamentals of what once was called the Arab nationalist commitment, the commitment of all colony, including the fact that Morocco was once a colony. All these things are forgotten in order to kind of sustain its own interest in the economic and colonial other interests in Western Sahara.
And also, I think it comes at a time when countries in Europe are kind of relatively beginning to consider the possibility of accepting the Moroccan proposal, which they had presented a while ago as well.
It's shameful, but if you see the fisheries agreement they signed a few years back, which has been objected by the Polisario Front strongly. Also, the mining in the area, which has been initiated in last few months or years, all of these basically were done by European countries, and European Union as a whole has been involved in dealing with. There are initial phases, of course, not officially recognized, but there are dealings with the Morocco over Western Sahara done by European Union in one way or another. So this is, of course, is ongoing, and we don't know. We might see at least some individual countries engaging with Morocco, and I think this will not be surprising given their history of colonial occupation in Africa.
Thank you so much, Abdul, for detailing both, of course, this very controversial issue as well as the previous one, and we'll come back to you in future episodes as well. And finally, after Antony Blinken and Janet Yellen, it was the turn of U.S. envoy for climate change, John Kerry, to make a visit to China. Now, Kerry met China's top diplomat Wang Yi and Prime Minister Li Qiang. The talk was all about mutual cooperation and working together. But the question remains as to whether the two countries can seriously work together, considering the US continuing encirclement of China and various restrictions it has placed. To answer what seems to be a question of perennial interest, we have Anish. Anish, so first of all, John Kerry's trip, was anticipated, of course, because it marks yet another trip by a top diplomat from the US to China, but also because climate is a serious issue for these two countries, and the US and China have a huge role to play. So maybe could you take us first of all through what was overall mood of the trip, the kind of statements, and what is on the agenda climate-wise?
Yes, Prashant. So what we're looking at right now is a very different kind of talk having happened. In the previous set of visits that we saw from the United States, you had senior officials visiting and them actually making statements about how the talks were positive. It could yield results in the future, and how everything was cordial. But very often you always found very valid kind of wariness from the Chinese side, from observers to newspapers to the government, actually putting out very calculated statements about how they're always worried about how the US will respond right after the talks, and every time we've seen some kind of provocations happening. But in this current scenario, the recent meeting, what we saw, there is some level of in principle agreement at some level, because climate crisis is real, climate change is real, and to actually combat it, you really need concerted efforts on a global level. And the two largest economies are definitely going to play a massive role. This is something that they both understand very well. It is just the question of who is going to commit at what level. And obviously, that is something that is yet to be smoothed out. Obviously, that would require significant level of diplomatic engagement and extended talks between the two nations in good faith. But that, in the previous meetings that we've seen over the past few years, especially under Trump, but also kind of, carried forward under Biden, is how the meetings never really yield results. Any kind of bilateral talks have always ended being a significant failure, primarily because the US has always used these talks either as, to score brownie points against China back home domestically, or to present China as an adversary. And that is something that cannot work when you're talking about cooperating when it comes to climate change, obviously. So obviously, that is something that the Chinese side has pointed out repeatedly. We need to wait and see what kind of commitment the US can actually offer at this point in time.
Right, and Anish, in this context, of course, also wanted to sort of take your views on what this means for the larger trajectory of US-China ties. Like you said, there's been a lot of zigs and zags on this. At some point, the hostility seems, very high, especially from the US side, and then you have this bevy. There is talks of, I think, the Commerce Secretary, the US Commerce Secretary, also set to head out to China soon. So, is this really a pivot, or is it just sort of pulling back from some of the, as very tactical pulling back from high tensions? Or, as we often speculated, are there also maybe clear divisions within the US establishment itself?
Well, there are definitely some level of discord in the manner in which the US establishment is functioning the past several years. Right now, we have definitely seen a very different kind of diplomatic engagement, but at the same time, when it comes to political statements being made back home, it's very different. Now, very recently, and if you're talking about relations normalizing at some level, we also need to talk about how the US has created certain flashpoints for tensions in the region, and that is not going to go away. Very recently, you have the frontrunner for the ruling party in what is the so-called Republic of China in Taiwan, visiting the United States, and China obviously protesting about it, because this person has very repeatedly not only entertained but also encouraged sort of separatist sentiments of creating a Taiwanese nation as opposed to a Chinese one. And so that is definitely something that is going to be a big problem. Obviously, Taiwan, we have talked about several times, is one of the issues. We also spoke about the South China Sea and how China is trying to deal with its neighbors, but at the same time, there are obviously tensions with some neighbors trying to bring in the United States, and so we are not very clear if there is going to be any resolution or even any kind of understanding of maintaining a certain status quo that can be sorted out with extended set of talks and diplomacy, but that is not happening either. So right now what we're seeing, as you pointed out, there is some level, is just some pulse, a kind of tactical retreat of tensions, and we do not know what will happen in a day or two, because there might be some senior official in the US who might use it,
or Biden might
make
say he is a dictator again. So
exactly, and it's just going to go down the drain again. So it's just something that do not we can't predict. It's become so unpredictable. US politics did not, at some level, was not so unpredictable, but when it comes to China, it has become increasingly unpredictable, primarily because there is no cohesion on how they want to deal with this large country that is becoming a big contender for their supremacy. So obviously that is one part of it, and we also need to, but at some level, as I pointed out, like there is some understanding even within Chinese and US establishment that climate crisis is something real and it is affecting everybody, and there needs to be some level of action that needs to be taken up, and it requires China, and China cannot be isolated in this matter. So all of these factors are something that the US establishment has very well in mind. It really just needs to be seen how they're going to move forward with it. So it is them that needs to really take many first steps to actually make something workable.
Right. Thank you so much, Anish, for giving us an overall view. And like I said, this was a matter of perennial interest. I suspect we'll keep coming back to this issue during each of these visits, during each of these rounds of statements. Thanks once again. Right, and so that's all we have for today's episode. We have covered, of course, occupation in Western Sahara. We've talked about the crisis of debt and, of course, one of the most important issues in the future, that is climate change itself. We'll be covering many such issues in future episodes of Daily Debrief. So keep watching. Also, do visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and follow us on all the social media platforms. Until next time.